They bound his hands, blindfolded his eyes, and paraded him backward on a donkey through the streets like a criminal. Then they locked him in a stone cell with no food, no water, and no future. 18 days later, the heir to the Scottish throne was dead. Officially, it was illness. In truth, it was slow, deliberate starvation. This is how they erased Prince David of Rothesay. In the chilling wind of October 1378, as Scotland's royal court huddled behind thick stone walls and hearth fires struggled against the creeping cold, a cry rose through the halls of Dunfermline Palace. Not a cry of grief, but of beginning. David Stuart was born, first son of John Stuart, Earl of Carrick, who would later ascend to become Robert III of Scotland. Yet from that very first breath, David's existence was less an invitation to joy and more a signal flare in a kingdom where ambition was currency and blood, no matter how royal, was expendable. He was the heir, the continuation of a dynasty that had clawed its way through civil strife, English threats, and internal betrayal. From the moment of his birth, titles were heaped upon him like iron chains disguised in velvet. Prince of Scotland, Earl of Carrick, Duke of Rothesay. These were not merely honors. They were markers, expectations, and perhaps worst of all, targets. And though the infant knew nothing of the men and shadows that gathered in whispered corners of the court, others knew. They watched. They calculated. Because when a boy is born to inherit a throne, he does not inherit peace. He inherits eyes, watching from above and below, all weighing the cost of his rise. His father, Robert III, was a man of frailty wrapped in the garments of a king. Weak in health and gentle in temperament, Robert was unsuited for the brutality of medieval politics, a court game played not with dice or words, but with daggers and prisons and secrets. For a time, David's mother, Queen Annabella Drummond, played the role of protector, fierce and politically astute. She kept her son close and the vipers of court just far enough away to prevent an early strike. But protection in royal courts is always temporary. David's early years were filled with instruction, not only in letters and scripture, but in decorum, diplomacy, and the delicate art of looking powerful without making enemies. He learned to speak in measured tones, to laugh only when it was safe, and to stand just close enough to the throne to seem ready, yet not close enough to seem eager. Every gesture was a performance, every moment a test. By the time he turned 10, he was already being paraded through state ceremonies, riding behind his father in processions, and appearing beside ambassadors in stiff portraits designed to reassure the nobles that Scotland's future was secure. But behind the gold-trimmed robes and ceremonial swords, a quieter story was taking shape. A story less about confidence and more about surveillance. David's life was not lived in freedom. It was a life of being watched. By tutors who measured his curiosity, by clerics who scrutinized his piety, by uncles who charted his growing popularity like a storm inching toward shore. And none watched closer than Robert Stuart, the man history would come to know as the Duke of Albany. Albany was the king's younger brother, and though he smiled in court, his gaze never softened. He too had ambitions. He too understood the value of proximity to the crown. And while David may have worn the titles of heir, Albany quietly gathered something far more useful: loyalty. He gained the trust of nobles skeptical of David's youth, the favor of clerics unimpressed by Annabella's independence, and the quiet respect of soldiers who believed strength, not blood, determined right to rule. To David, Albany was just uncle, another figure in a long line of courtiers who offered advice without invitation. But to others, Albany was the alternative. The steady hand, the seasoned statesman, the man who could take the reins if the boy proved too green or the father too feeble. And so, while David studied governance in candlelit chambers and learned the art of signing decrees with poise, his uncle studied him. Even in the records, you can feel the pressure. Chroniclers note how early David was involved in royal decisions, how frequently his name appeared beside state proclamations. He wasn't merely being prepared for the throne, he was being thrust toward it, perhaps faster than was wise. And yet, no one dared slow him. To question the prince was to question the future. To question Albany was unthinkable. What does it do to a boy, knowing he is the future of a kingdom, yet sensing, though never hearing aloud, that his life is a problem others are already trying to solve? What does it do to a teenager, praised in public and undermined in private, trained in justice but raised in fear? By the time David reached his 20s, he was already two people: the Prince of Scotland, admired and adored in processions and parliaments, and the young man behind closed doors, ever alert to shifts in tone, ever aware that behind every toast to his health might be a silent prayer for his failure. In another world, with a father strong enough to rule and a court loyal enough to protect him, perhaps David's story would have unfolded as most royal stories aim to: coronation, conquest, consolidation. But this was not that world. Scotland was splintered, fraught with noble feuds and English threats, and above all, poisoned by internal rivalries masquerading as alliances. And in such a world, being born a prince is not a promise, it's a trap. He was young, he was intelligent, he was the future. And yet, from the moment of his birth, a noose had been quietly prepared, not of rope, but of silence, of suspicion, of plans written in ink but enforced with stone. And as David smiled in portraits and read from scriptures, his enemies smiled too, waiting for the moment when the child would become a threat and the future could be rewritten without him. By the end of the 14th century, the throne of Scotland had become less a seat of power and more a flickering candle held between unsteady hands. King Robert III, once the Earl of Carrick, now wore the crown not with authority, but with a trembling quietness that unsettled even his allies. And in the growing void of leadership, Scotland found itself not just vulnerable to enemies beyond the border, but also to ambitions blooming within its own nobility, like moss on a rotting wall. It was in this fragile atmosphere, in the uneasy year of 1399, that David Stewart, barely 21 years old, was appointed lieutenant of the realm, an office that granted him sweeping powers of governance, effectively making him the acting ruler, while his father withdrew further into sickness, silence, and ceremonial irrelevance, too weak in both health and will to resist the political shifts swirling around him. The announcement came not with cheers, but with calculated nods from the court, for while David's ascension to power was lawful and expected, it was also dangerous. His sudden leap from prince to ruler placed him squarely in the center of a throne room where every polished floor tile had ears, and every goblet of wine carried the aftertaste of watching eyes and whispered threats. In the months that followed his appointment, David proved himself capable in ways that startled even his detractors. He held councils with firmness, issued decrees with surprising clarity, and made efforts, albeit not always successful, to assert the authority of the crown in regions long fractured by clan loyalty and noble independence, especially along the periphery where English threats licked at the border like fire testing the strength of old timber. His leadership, however, was never allowed to breathe freely. Every decision he made, every alliance he attempted, every punishment he handed down was dissected not only by his advisors, but, more dangerously, by the ever-silent figure who remained firmly seated just outside the circle of power. Robert Stuart, Duke of Albany, his uncle, his blood, and perhaps the most practiced hand at quiet subversion Scotland had ever known. Albany did not shout his dissent. He did not stage overt rebellion or rise in arms. Instead, he smiled from behind the tapestry of governance, sending letters rather than soldiers, cultivating friendships with nobles who felt slighted by David's reforms, and presenting himself always as a servant of stability while privately sharpening the blade of opportunity against the stone of patience. David may have been the one seated in council, signing royal orders and representing the crown in diplomatic matters. But Albany was the one gathering men of influence in shadowed halls, offering them something far more seductive than legitimacy. He offered them the illusion of safety, the promise of continuity without disruption, and in a land weary of instability, that was often enough. Tensions began to emerge, quietly at first. Like cracks under plaster, David's decisions regarding ecclesiastical revenues, his redistribution of certain royal lands, and his handling of court finances began to alienate the church and certain conservative factions among the nobility, many of whom were already uneasy with the idea of a young ruler whose energy they mistook for arrogance and whose reforms they feared might upset the fragile balance of their privilege. Yet even then, David seemed unaware, or perhaps unwilling to believe, that the very powers meant to protect the kingdom were slowly arranging his undoing, not with confrontation, but with legal procedure, not with blades, but with parchment and complaint. It is here, in this moment of growing isolation and political encirclement, that the deeper tragedy begins to take form. Not the sudden collapse of a weak prince, but the deliberate deconstruction of a capable young man who lacked only one thing: the cruelty to suspect those closest to him. The records speak of David attempting to navigate this increasingly hostile environment with confidence, meeting foreign envoys, pursuing domestic stabilization, even arranging marriage alliances meant to fortify his standing. But all the while, Albany and his loyalists were quietly reframing the prince's actions not as governance, but as overreach, not as reform, but as misrule, feeding these interpretations into the ears of Parliament and the clergy, who needed only a small nudge to doubt a boy they never fully accepted. By 1401, rumors were circulating that David was too impulsive, too disrespectful of sacred customs, too involved in the control of church revenues, and worst of all, too eager to act without consulting those older, wiser, and, in Albany's framing, more committed to the realm's stability than its shifting royal bloodlines. And still, David ruled, because he believed, perhaps naively, that merit and intention were enough to protect a prince in a time of unrest. But politics, especially in royal courts, is rarely about merit. It is about timing. And Albany was a master of waiting, of letting the young heir rise just high enough that his fall would appear not as a coup, but as consequence, not as murder, but as correction. David's authority began to narrow. His letters grew less frequent in royal registers. His edicts were delayed or questioned. His supporters dwindled, silenced by fear or replaced by more agreeable men. And all the while, his father, the king in name only, drifted further into seclusion, watching from afar as his firstborn son was slowly pushed toward the edge of a trap that had been prepared years in advance. One might imagine David, seated in the grand halls of Stirling or Perth, poring over papers and listening to ministers, still believing he could wrest control back from the margins. But the truth is, by the time the tide had fully turned, he was already surrounded by those who answered not to the prince, but to the man waiting behind the curtain. A throne, after all, is not always taken by force. Sometimes, it is hollowed from within, When Queen Annabella Drummond died in 1401, the bells rang across the highlands and lowlands of Scotland with the heavy cadence of mourning. But within the inner sanctums of the royal court, behind carved doors and between cold columns, the silence that followed her passing was not simply sorrow. It was calculation. As though the stillness itself was measuring the vacuum her absence created and weighing how quickly it could be filled by something far darker than grief. Annabella had been more than a queen consort. She was the last immovable barrier between her son and the wolves that stalked him under the guise of kinship. The final living voice in the court who dared raise a tone against Albany's insinuations, who had the courage and the lineage to call his political maneuverings what they were. Thinly veiled threats cloaked in the language of duty. With her death, David was no longer shielded by maternal vigilance, no longer buoyed by a presence whose loyalty was unquestionable and whose alliances held weight in both ecclesiastical and noble circles. And in her absence, those who had long waited for the Queen's voice to go silent began to speak more freely, dressing old accusations in new robes, speaking aloud the suspicions they had once whispered only in the dark. The first blade drawn against David was not steel, but suspicion. Allegations, murmurs, and formal grievances, which appeared almost immediately after the Queen's burial, presented with the solemnity of justice, but delivered with the rhythm of vengeance. Chief among these was the charge of embezzlement, an accusation so convenient it hardly needed proof, especially in a time when record-keeping was as inconsistent as the loyalties of those tasked with maintaining it. They claimed he had diverted revenues from lands belonging to the church, that he had collected taxes under his own seal rather than the royal one, that he had redistributed rents without approval, as if asserting royal authority during a time of regency was not just improper, but treasonous. Though never stated in those terms, for such words, if spoken too soon, might raise the memory of Annabella's defense, a memory still too recent to fully erase. More damning, perhaps, were the charges of arrogance, that David had spoken too bluntly to senior clergy, that he had failed to observe certain ecclesiastical customs, that he had shown disrespect not just to institutions, but to men whose pride demanded reverence, and whose enmity, once provoked, was rarely quieted with apologies, especially from someone younger, more beloved, and, most threatening of all, more legitimate in the eyes of the crown. But even these claims, however dressed in righteousness, were insufficient without orchestration. And that is where Albany thrived. He did not need to push the accusations forward with force. He merely needed to permit them space to grow, to allow the machinery of Parliament and church inquiry to turn naturally toward the prince, knowing that once it began to spin, it would not stop until it ground him beneath its weight. David, still lieutenant of the realm, still acting in his father's name, was summoned to defend himself. Not in a fair court, not before a neutral assembly, but in a chamber where every seat had already been assigned, every voice already persuaded, every verdict already known. And in that room, where the walls themselves seemed to lean inward with expectation, he was told he had violated the sacred trust of the kingdom, that his governance was reckless, that his ambitions exceeded the scope of his station. What could he say? What evidence could he present? The books had been altered, the witnesses silenced, the treasury accounts reshaped by those who answered to Albany's purse, not the prince's signature. And in that twisted theater of legality, David found himself stripped not of title, not yet, but of the most important currency in medieval politics, credibility. For a prince to be distrusted was to be dismantled. And Albany, ever the master of perception, ensured that distrust did not fall like thunder, but rather seeped in like rain through stone, so that when the time came to take action, there would be no cries of injustice, only sighs of inevitability. Still, David resisted, not by sword, for he had no army, not by edict, for he had no authority, but by presence, by continuing to appear in court functions, by walking among nobles with chin held high, by behaving as though the truth would defend him if he simply endured long enough. But truth, in royal courts, does not walk alone. It must be carried by powerful hands, and David had fewer of those with each passing week. Supporters disappeared, some through death, others through fear, and many simply through absence, as though standing beside the prince had become an act of quiet rebellion that no one dared commit. In the chronicles of the time, there are gaps, blank days where David's movements are unrecorded, where meetings occurred without him, where decisions were made in his name but against his will. He was still the heir, still the Duke of Rothesay, still the son of a king. But in practice, he was already a ghost. And though no iron bars had yet enclosed him, and no dungeon door had yet slammed shut, he was, in all but ceremony, a prisoner of politics, of power, of a kingdom that had decided its future could not include him, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too soon. It began not with a proclamation, nor with a formal declaration of guilt, but with a knock at the door, a slow, deliberate pounding on the heavy wooden panels of the chamber, where David Stuart, heir to the throne of Scotland, had been staying under a veil of formality that now peeled away like old paint, revealing the raw brick of betrayal beneath. And when he opened that door, he was not greeted by messengers or counselors, but by soldiers. Men in armor who once bowed at his approach, now gripping iron manacles in hands that did not tremble. There was no reading of charges, no opportunity to speak in his own defense, no royal command spoken aloud in the king's voice, only the quiet assertion that he must come with them. And though his name was never stripped from him, nor his title formally revoked, the symbolism was unmistakable. When the heir to a kingdom is taken from his room in silence, with wrists bound and eyes blindfolded, it is not justice that is being enacted. It is a message being sent. They bound him with coarse rope, tighter than necessary, and as they led him from the chambers, he could feel the watching eyes of servants, nobles, and guards, none daring to intervene, none speaking his name, as though in that moment the prince had become untouchable, not by reverence, but by danger. Someone whose proximity might implicate, someone whose fall might drag others down with him, someone already marked for disappearance. But the indignity did not end in quiet halls. They brought him outside, into the daylight, into the streets. And there, in one of the most chillingly orchestrated spectacles of political degradation in Scotland's medieval history, they placed him backward on a donkey. Not a war horse, not a royal steed, but a beast of burden, a creature reserved for peasants and transport, made now into a throne of mockery. To ride backward was no accident. It was a punishment rooted in medieval ritual humiliation, a symbol that the rider had reversed the natural order, had behaved shamefully, had earned scorn. And for David, whose position demanded dignity, the act transformed his image in an instant, turning the heir of kings into the subject of laughter, turning the son of Robert III into an object lesson for anyone who might dream too boldly. They led the donkey through the town square, past markets and courtyards, past faces he had once seen lit with loyalty, and now saw twisted in discomfort, amusement, or fear. And all the while, he remained silent, not out of submission, but out of stunned recognition that this was not merely punishment for an offense, but a surgical public erasure. a slow grinding of reputation meant to ensure that even if he survived the ordeal, he would never again wear authority without mockery clinging to his heels. Chroniclers would later describe the moment as a march of mockery. And though their records are sparse, their tone reveals enough that this was not a simple arrest, not an act of justice, but a ritual cleansing, a deliberate stripping of status designed not to kill the man, but to kill the memory of his right to rule. Children laughed. Old men turned away. Merchants stood still, weighing their expressions carefully, uncertain whether to cheer or weep. And among them, hidden in the alleys and upper windows, were Albany's men, watching, noting, ensuring that the humiliation struck deeply, that the prince's posture broke slowly, that no surge of sympathy gained traction among the masses. There is no record of what David thought during this forced procession. No letters survive. No first-hand accounts speak of his expression. But one can imagine the taste of iron on his tongue. Not just from blood, if he bit down against pain, but from the bitter understanding that once a prince is laughed at in the open, the crown he was born to wear becomes a shadow. A weight that no longer rests on his head, but on the memory of what might have been. When they reached the gates of Falkland Palace, the place that would serve not as a residence, but as a tomb, they did not unbind him with ceremony. They dragged him from the donkey, not with the grace reserved for royalty, but with the efficiency of wardens. And as they led him inside, the doors closed behind them with a finality that echoed more like a burial than an imprisonment. And yet, even then, no official statement was issued. No public verdict, no proclamation from the king. To the world, David was not dead, not dethroned, not even convicted. He had simply been removed for questioning, a phrase so vague it meant everything and nothing. A fog of legality that allowed the crown and parliament to continue functioning without explanation, and Albany to continue consolidating power without consequence. It is in this space, invisible, undefined, that the cruelest form of destruction occurs. Not execution, which offers closure. Not exile, which offers distance, but erasure by humiliation. For when a prince is seen not as a threat but as a clown, when his face becomes synonymous with disgrace rather than authority, when his name is followed not by your grace but by laughter, the throne he was born to inherit becomes a relic buried in ridicule. And so David of Rothesay, who once signed decrees and addressed noble councils, who once bore the hopes of a divided kingdom on his young shoulders, now found himself reduced to a cautionary tale before his death even arrived. A living ghost, a prince dethroned not by sword, but by smirk. Falkland Palace, though dressed in the outer garments of nobility, with its carved stone archways and tapestries left to sway in the drafts, was never intended to be a prison in the architectural sense. There were no barred towers like those at Stirling, no dungeon pits like those whispered about in English castles. But for David Stewart, it would become something worse. A place that wore the mask of elegance while suffocating him in silence. A palace built for kings that became a mausoleum for a prince still breathing. He was brought there under the guise of containment, not punishment. A word choice meant to soften the truth, to paint his confinement as temporary, necessary, even civil, as if locking away the heir to the Scottish throne was an unfortunate formality, rather than the first act in a slow, deliberate execution carried out in whispers and shadows, rather than gallows and sword. The cell where they kept him was not listed on any official record, not named in royal inventories, not remembered fondly in the correspondence of those who walked the palace halls above. It was a room with no windows, no hearth, no means of measuring time, except for the rhythm of pain and thirst and the scraping of fingernails against stone that no one would ever hear because no one was meant to hear them. He was alone, completely. No guards posted in ceremony, no physician sent to monitor his condition, no priest dispatched to offer last rites, because to send any of those would be to acknowledge that something was happening. And the entire structure of Albany's plot, Shah Mitzvot, depended on the illusion that nothing was. That David was simply elsewhere, inconveniently removed for the good of governance, waiting quietly in a palace he had once walked through as a noble guest, now reduced to a breathing relic hidden beneath its floors. There are no surviving records of his treatment during those days. No written orders, no logs of food deliveries, no servant accounts. But absence, in this case, is its own testimony. For Falkland was a royal residence, and royal residences document everything. Who enters, who dines, who sleeps where, which candles are ordered, how much wood is burned for the fire. And yet for David, the pages are blank. That silence, that void in the historical ledger, is louder than any confession. It screams that he was not meant to be seen, not meant to be cared for, not meant to leave. He was meant to vanish, slowly, without bloodshed, without spectacle, without martyrdom. Inside the stone chamber, the air was thick with damp, and the floor, cold even in late spring, bled into his bones through the thin layer of cloth that had once been royal robes, now creased and dirtied and stuck to his body like a burial shroud before the grave had even opened. He cried out at first. He knocked. He begged. But even desperation has a limit, and over time his voice likely grew hoarse, his knocks slower, his prayers more fragmented. Not because hope left him, but because energy did. And without food, without water, without light, the days collapsed into each other like dominoes in the dark. Some chroniclers would later speculate that he died of dysentery, a plausible cause given the conditions, the lack of hygiene, the complete absence of care. And yet even that diagnosis, offered in retrospect, feels like a polite fiction, a way to sanitize what was truly happening, to mask starvation beneath a medical term, to make it sound less deliberate than it was. But there is no dignity in such euphemisms. There is only the slow unraveling of a human body, reduced by hunger to trembling, by thirst to hallucination, by isolation to a kind of unraveling that no autopsy could quantify. At some point, perhaps on the 6th day or the 9th or the 12th, his muscles would have begun to seize, his skin pulling tight over bone, his thoughts flickering between memory and dream. And though no one was there to record it, you can imagine the moment when the realization sank in that he was not being held for trial, not being prepared for redemption, but was simply being left to die, cell by cell. What cruelty exists in murder is often measured in the weapon. But here, the cruelty was time. 18 days. That's how long they left him. 18 days of nothing. 18 days of shrinking, of fading, of becoming a name carved in air. By the final days, it's likely his voice was gone, his consciousness fractured, his body unrecognizable from the proud figure that once rode through parades and sat in parliament chambers. By then, he would have been skin and silence, a prince in title only, a boy whose royal blood had been bled not by blade, but by forgetting. And still, outside, the world turned. Horses trotted across Falkland's courtyard. Candles were lit in the upper halls. Guests dined in rooms not far above him. The palace functioned, and yet beneath the luxury and order, there lay a breathing corpse. A prince kept alive just long enough for his memory to rot alongside his flesh, so that by the time his heart stopped, it would feel less like death and more like relief. When they finally opened the door, and here, the records resume, briefly, coldly. They found him curled in the corner, eyes sunken, cheeks hollow, hands drawn to his chest like a child shielding himself from a punishment he could not escape. He weighed little more than a boy. He looked nothing like a ruler. He was, in essence, already a ghost. And no one was charged. No one punished. The death was attributed to illness, and the silence that followed was not shame. It was success. For in the world of power, the quietest executions are often the most effective. When they finally opened the door to David's cell, 18 days after it had been sealed with neither blessing nor documentation, it was not the sight of death that chilled the guards to stillness, but the unmistakable residue of silence that had settled over the room, like dust on untouched relics, a silence so thick, so saturated with abandonment, that it made the living hesitate, as though stepping into a tomb built not by masons, but by men in power who preferred their executions clean, bloodless, and deniable. He was lying against the far wall, not sprawled as if felled suddenly, but curled inward, knees to chest, hands drawn tight as though even in his last breaths he had been trying to protect something. His dignity, his memory, the fading flame of his name. But there was no crown to shield, no robe to wrap around his legacy, only a body reduced by starvation to the skeletal outline of a prince who had once governed councils and commanded rooms with the weight of royal expectation pressing invisibly but constantly on his back. His face was drawn, the skin stretched over his jaw like canvas on a cracked frame, and his lips, split and parched, were parted slightly, not in agony, but in the soft slackness of surrender, as though the final breath had not been a gasp or a cry, but a whisper into the dark. A question left unanswered by any god or man still willing to listen. No food had been recorded. No water had been delivered. Not a single servant's name appeared on the rolls during those 18 days. And while official chronicles would later suggest illness, dysentery perhaps, or fever brought on by isolation, the specifics are telling in their vagueness. For when a prince dies in captivity and no one records his meals, no one testifies to his care, no one speaks of a physician summoned to his side, what remains is not evidence of disease, but of intent. Intent not to kill swiftly, but to let nature, deprived of nurture, do what human hands dared not be seen doing. The hunger must have begun as a gnawing in his gut, sharp and insistent. But within a few days, it would have dulled into a constant ache. The kind that makes the body eat itself in desperation. First drawing from the fat, then from the muscle, and finally from the organs, until the line between hunger and pain is erased and replaced by a fog of exhaustion so dense that even prayer becomes effort, and even memory loses weight. By the end of the first week, the thirst would have eclipsed everything. Unlike hunger, thirst is not patient. It strangles quickly, cracks the lips, burns the throat, dries the eyes, and darkens the mind. And while hunger hollows the body, thirst hollows time. Minutes stretch into hours, thoughts into hallucinations, and the boundaries between night and day, dream and despair, begin to collapse into a single colorless blur. There were no lights in that room, no window, no measure of passing days except what David might have kept in his own mind. Scratches on stone, the count of his prayers, the fading rhythm of his heartbeat. But all of these are guesses, because there is nothing left of his voice in the records, nothing left of his resistance. Only the certainty that when the door finally opened, no cries of protest emerged, no final words were spoken. He had already become silence, and that perhaps was the goal all along. Not simply to kill the body, but to erase the presence, to make the heir to the Scottish throne die in such stillness that no one would feel compelled to avenge him, to make his death not a thunderclap, but a muffled cough that could be explained away in half a sentence, buried beneath layers of plausible deniability and wrapped in the language of providence. Parliament, when informed of his passing, did not call for inquiry. There were no tribunals, no official blamed. The Duke of Albany, who had orchestrated the slow disappearance of his nephew with the patience of a spider and the composure of a clerk, expressed formal condolences, but no guilt. He issued no apology because no charge had been brought, and he bore no stain because no blood had been spilled. Only hunger administered like a political sedative, a slow quieting of succession until the noise of youth and promise faded completely into the stone of Falkland. The church said it was God's will, that the prince had been called home before his time, that suffering purifies the soul, that death comes to all, and often without warning. But what does it mean when a man dies not by fate, but by neglect, not in battle, but in a room where even light was forbidden? What does it mean when a royal heir, a symbol of a nation's future, is reduced to a husk behind a locked door, while the halls above host banquets and the courtiers toast the stability preserved in his absence? It means the kingdom has rewritten what treason looks like. It no longer wears a sword. It wears a ledger. It no longer shouts. It starves. And David, in dying, revealed not only the cruelty of his enemies, but the apathy of those who might have saved him and chose instead to close their doors, avert their eyes, and let silence do what politics could not risk being caught doing. His body was removed quietly, wrapped in cloth, unceremonious. No herald announced his death. No bard composed a lament. No decree mourned his absence. And thus the prince who had once held the keys to Scotland's future became a name whispered, then avoided, then forgotten. But the silence remains. It lingers in the walls of Falkland. It hums beneath the floorboards. And it asks a question not easily dismissed. When a kingdom kills its own future, how long before it forgets it had one? There was no procession. No rows of black-clad nobles walking slowly behind a draped coffin. No dirges carried through cathedral arches. No tolling bells echoing across stone valleys to mark the passing of a prince who had once been expected to inherit a realm carved by war, held together by treaties and stained, again and again, by the blood of its own future. Instead, there was a silence so deliberate, so structured in its absence, that it became louder than any funeral choir, louder than any trumpet's cry of mourning. A silence maintained not by grief, but by fear, cultivated like a shadow stretching across the land from Falkland to Edinburgh, ensuring that no voice would rise too high, no memory linger too long, no monument be raised that might tempt a people to ask the question they were not permitted to voice. Why did the prince die in darkness? He was buried quietly, not in the royal vault, not in the heart of the capital, but at Lindores Abbey, a quiet monastic site far from the beating core of courtly life, chosen not for its grandeur, but for its discretion, for its distance from power, for its capacity to hold a body without drawing a crowd, to accept a corpse without inviting a reckoning. There was no crown placed upon the casket, no ceremonial blade laid beside him to symbolize honor in death. There were no carved angels above his tomb, no royal standard folded with reverence, no royal chronicle that documented his final hours with the poetry usually reserved for kings and martyrs. There was only earth and grass, and a burial performed so swiftly that even some within the court heard about it only days later. Heard about it not from messengers, but from whispers, from servants, from travelers who had seen monks muttering prayers in haste as the ground was closed over what was once a sovereign in waiting. The Parliament did not open session with mourning. The church did not declare a day of fasting or prayer. The king, Robert III, made no speech. And in that silence, something more insidious was born: the normalization of his disappearance. David had not been assassinated in the open. He had not fallen on the battlefield, had not been condemned before the realm. And because of this, the collective mind of the kingdom was forced into a strange compliance with the fiction it was offered: that his death was natural, or at least inevitable, or at the very least unremarkable. But people remember things differently when they are not allowed to speak. And while the nobles moved on, their hands busy with land disputes and trade, the common folk, those who had once seen David ride through their towns, who had heard him speak at public gatherings, who had cheered him on as a symbol of youth and change, began to carry his memory in a different way. Not as history, but as rumor. Not as fact, but as grief sharpened by unease. They whispered about the donkey. They whispered about the bindings. They whispered about how thin he had become, how no one had seen him fed, how the guards stationed at Falkland had refused to meet the eyes of travelers asking after the prince. And those whispers spread, not in declarations or accusations, but in careful phrases exchanged between bakers and butchers, between shepherds on hills and mothers rocking infants by hearth fires. Phrases that wrapped suspicion in story and kept the truth alive, not through parchment, but through repetition. In one version, he had been poisoned by a priest. In another, his uncle had smothered him with a velvet pillow. Others claimed he had starved willingly, refusing food in protest until God took him. None of these versions were accurate, and yet all of them were truer than the official silence, because they acknowledged the cruelty, the betrayal, the unnaturalness of a prince dying alone, while his kingdom continued to host feasts and negotiate marriages as if nothing had happened. And so his name became dangerous, not for what it revealed, but for what it forced others to remember. To speak of David was to invite discomfort. To mention his burial was to question Albany. To recall his final days was to suggest that power in Scotland did not flow cleanly from blood, or even from divine right, but from cunning, from timing, from the ability to ensure that inconvenient heirs could be made to vanish without staining the marble halls of the court. Even the poets were silent. Those who once composed epics for nobles lost in war, who crafted odes for the sons of earls and warriors cut down in their prime, found no words for David, not because he was unworthy, but because to sing of him was to remind the realm that legitimacy had no sanctuary, that innocence had no shield, and that in Scotland, ambition wore a familiar face and walked in shoes that left no footprints. Years passed. The abbey grass grew, new banners were sown, the realm adjusted. And yet, every so often, someone would pause near the ruins of Lindores, where the grave bore no name, and swear they felt something in the wind. A chill that did not match the season, a stillness that did not belong, as if the silence surrounding David had never truly ended, but had simply embedded itself in the stones, waiting for someone brave enough to ask again what really happened, and why no one was punished. The kingdom mourned, but it mourned in whispers, because to grieve too loudly was to call attention, and attention, in those days, was as dangerous as treason. With David's body buried in quiet soil, and his name drifting into the dangerous fog of unspoken memory, the stage was finally cleared for the man who had orchestrated it all. Not with a sword, not with fire, not with proclamations shouted from ramparts, but with the meticulous, gloved hand of bureaucracy, patience, and well-placed silences that crushed as effectively as gallows ever could. Robert Stuart, Duke of Albany, did not celebrate, for celebration would have drawn suspicion. He did not raise his banner higher, did not demand titles he had not already acquired, and did not dress in brighter robes. For men like Albany understood that true power was never taken in a moment. It was allowed to settle like mist, allowed to fill the room slowly, until one day, everyone woke up breathing it without realizing they had ever inhaled anything else. The king, Robert III, remained technically on the throne, but in truth, he was only a shadow wrapped in crown and robes, a man broken by age, grief, and the weight of cowardice that comes not from malice, but from knowing too late that you were never truly in control, and that every ounce of mercy you withheld, every warning you ignored, had carved the path that led your firstborn son into a cell, and left him there to vanish without trial, without legacy, without even an enemy brave enough to say his name aloud in court. Robert III could do nothing. His voice, once soft, had become inaudible. His will, once hesitant, had dissolved entirely. And Albany, recognizing the corpse still seated on the throne, moved quickly, not in appearance but in effect, ensuring that every counsel, every policy, every noble alliance passed through his hands first, that every road to influence led through his halls, and that no petition was granted without his silent approval. No punishment rendered unless he had already weighed the consequences and ensured they benefited him in ways both immediate and long-lasting. There was no resistance, because by then, resistance had learned to speak in whispers and sleep with both eyes open. And so, while the black banners of mourning were barely lowered from Falkland's towers, Albany's consolidation of power was already complete, executed not with the violence of revolution, but with the quiet elegance of vacancy. David was gone, Robert was paralyzed, and the rest of Scotland, numbed by fear and trained by centuries of bloodshed, accepted what had happened not because they believed it was just, but because they understood that justice was a fiction reserved for the living and the loud, and David had become neither. But Albany was not yet finished, because while the death of David had removed one obstacle, it left behind another, one that still bore royal blood, still had the potential to grow into a symbol, still stood in the long shadow of succession. James, the younger brother, 10 years old, curious-eyed, quieter than David, less impulsive, but equally dangerous in the eyes of those who saw the throne not as heritage, but as leverage. Albany did not move against James directly. Not yet. Instead, it was the king himself, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps in one last flicker of desperate paternal instinct, who ordered that James be sent away, not into exile, not into hiding, but to France, under the pretext of education and diplomatic safety, far from Albany's reach, across the sea where he might live, grow, and return when the kingdom had steadied and the poison at its core had passed. But fate, or something colder, intervened. Because as the ship bearing the young prince crossed the channel, it was intercepted not by enemies of Albany, not by Scottish rivals, but by English pirates. And in that strange twist of political misfortune, or strategic fortune, depending on which lips you believe, the boy was captured, handed over to King Henry IV of England, and kept not as a guest, not as a ward, but as a prisoner, a living bargaining chip, a royal son now held hostage in the very country Scotland had warred with for generations. And with that, Albany's final barrier to uncontested power vanished. Not through murder this time, not through starvation, but through sheer, miraculous convenience that history would later question, though never prove. For 18 years, James would remain in England. 18 years in which Albany ruled Scotland with the confident ease of a man who had already proven he could remove an heir without inciting a revolt. 18 years during which he wore no crown, but wielded its authority, made no claims of kingship, but exercised all of its privileges, walking the thin line between regent and ruler, with the steady poise of a man whose greatest asset was the public's unwillingness to die for a name no longer spoken. He maintained the illusion of serving the realm, of guarding it in the king's name, of defending it until James's return. But he ensured that return would be neither swift nor easy. And in the meantime, he reshaped the government in his own image, placing allies in every court, neutralizing opposition not through death, but through denial of favor, through withdrawal of funds, through exile dressed as diplomacy. There were those who saw through it, nobles who remembered David, priests who whispered sermons with thorns buried beneath the liturgy, mothers who clutched their children closer when Albany passed. But none could act, because by then, fear had metastasized into compliance, and the cost of defiance was no longer measured in trial or fine, but in silence, starvation, and unmarked graves. Albany ruled, not as king, not as tyrant, but as something worse, a shadow that did not need to shout to be obeyed. A man who had proven that in Scotland, power belonged not to the loudest nor the most righteous, but to the one who knew how to wait for the right silence and fill it. In the years that followed David's quiet death and Albany's uninterrupted rise, the official records of Scotland moved forward with chilling efficiency, shifting their ink to taxes and treaties, to noble marriages and land disputes, as if the heir who had once carried the weight of a realm's future had never existed at all, not erased with fire or sword, but overwritten with the mundane bureaucracy of governance, drowned beneath the deliberate tides of paperwork, titles, and the passage of forgettable time. The royal household did not speak his name. No portrait was commissioned posthumously, no effigy carved in alabaster, no stained glass window rising in a cathedral to catch the morning light with his image, no statue placed in gardens where he once walked, not even a commemorative seal minted to honor his brief time as the kingdom's acting guardian. Nothing remained in the visible narrative of the crown that might provoke the question of where he had gone or why no justice ever followed the silence that devoured him. To forget David was not an accident. It was a strategy. A strategy designed not only to cleanse the political air of a scandal that might ignite unrest, but also to avoid martyrdom. For a prince who dies too publicly, too brutally, too bravely, becomes a rallying cry. But a prince who dies in the dark, who leaves no letters, no final words, no dramatic last stand, becomes a question too dangerous to ask and too easy to avoid. But memory, real memory, the kind that survives without monuments, has a way of hiding in places that records cannot reach. In the muttered stories of old women who still remembered the sound of his name announced at festivals. In the warnings passed from father to son about trusting those too close to the throne. In the long pauses that followed when a bard sang of Scotland's line of kings, but skipped a verse as if one chapter had simply vanished without notice. And so, while David's presence was systematically scrubbed from the pages of royal history, he remained trapped in the margins of 100 lesser documents, in the whispers of chroniclers who dared not accuse, but could not entirely forget, in the half-sentences that trailed off when describing the events of 1402, where misfortune stood in for murder and illness covered the wound left by hunger that was not accidental, but designed. In some circles, he was called reckless, a young man whose ambition outpaced his discipline, who dared too much, spoke too plainly, ruled too boldly in a kingdom that preferred its heirs quiet, pliable, and unthreatening to the older men who held the purse strings and the power behind the curtain. Others remembered him as a martyr, too trusting, too good-hearted, raised under the protective wing of a queen who saw in him the potential for renewal, for reform, for a Scotland less burdened by nepotism and fear. A queen whose death allowed the knives to emerge and whose absence became the final blessing Albany needed to unmake her son. But the most honest remembered him differently. Not as a symbol, not as a hero, not even as a tragedy, but as a warning. Because what David's story revealed, more clearly than any rebellion or battlefield loss, was that legitimacy alone means nothing if power has already been claimed by others. That lineage cannot protect those who underestimate how quickly allies become enemies once protection fades. That in the absence of a voice loud enough to resist, silence becomes not just a condition, but a weapon. A method of control more effective than chains or poison. No uprising ever rose for David. No rebellion carried his name into battle. No hidden letters surfaced from a forgotten friend demanding vengeance in parchment and ink. Instead, he faded, month by month, year by year, until even his grave lost certainty. Until historians debated whether his bones lay beneath Lindores Abbey or elsewhere. Until the very place where he had once signed royal orders became a palace remembered more for hunting parties and feasts than for the ghost that had once starved within its walls. And yet, if you walked the halls of that palace years later, the servants still refused to linger too long in its deepest corridors. If you passed Lindores on a cold morning, monks still prayed a little longer beside the unmarked plot. If you questioned the older men who kept the old stories alive in taverns and lowland farms, they would still lower their voices at the mention of the Duke's boy, as if the mere act of recalling him might stir something best left beneath the earth. Even in forgetting, Scotland remembered. Not in policy or celebration, but in discomfort. Not in reverence, but in guilt. And that guilt, like a stain never fully washed from royal hands, persisted across generations. Whispered through the cracks of stone walls, hinted at in the nervous glances of descendants who understood that their blood came with ghosts, and that every crown carried the weight of those who were never allowed to wear it. Eventually, James would return. The younger brother, the stolen prince, hardened by English captivity, would reclaim the throne that David had never lived to inherit. And in his rule, often ruthless, often cold, one can glimpse a shadow not entirely his own, the shape of a sibling lost not to war or chance, but to politics sharpened into cruelty, to silence used as execution. James never spoke of David in public. He erected no monument. He issued no condemnation of Albany, even after the Duke's death. But perhaps that was the most honest memorial of all. A kingdom that learned from what it did not say. A ruler who understood that speaking aloud some truths only invites their repetition. And that the real legacy of a murdered heir is not carved in stone, but buried in the habits of those who come after. Haunted, cautious, never trusting power unless it is held tightly, ruthlessly, and alone. So what do we owe to David Stewart? Not pity, not reverence, but remembrance. Because when a prince is silenced without trial and no one dares to raise their voice, the least we can do, centuries later, is to speak his name, not to redeem him, but to remind ourselves that the quietest deaths are often the ones most carefully planned. Today, there is no marked grave for David Stewart. No statue casts his shadow on the stones of Edinburgh. No plaque beside the throne reminds Scotland of the boy who nearly ruled. And in Lindores Abbey, weathered, roofless, surrendered to wind and moss, you'll find no name carved in certainty, only ruins scattered with prayers that have long since lost their intended recipient. and stones too tired to hold the memory of a prince who was never meant to be remembered. The abbey itself breathes with absence. Its arches, now open to the sky, seem to lean inward as if still listening, still holding the echoes of a voice that once called for water, for justice, for his mother, for someone, anyone, to open the door. If you stand there at dusk, in the slanted light of a dying day, and close your eyes long enough to forget the centuries, the wind that moves through the grass doesn't feel like nature. It feels like a question left unanswered, circling the ruins with the patience of grief that has never been granted its proper name. What does it mean to die for a throne you never sat on? To be raised with titles, draped in expectation, praised in banquets, toasted in courtly halls, and then, just as quickly, to be stripped of food, of light, of name, and to slip out of the world so quietly that the kingdom didn't even pause to mark your exit? What does it mean to be born with a future so heavy that others decided you were too dangerous to carry it? David's life is not a tragedy in the theatrical sense. There was no final speech. No dramatic betrayal screamed across a battlefield. No famous duel that sealed his fate. But that is precisely what makes it more haunting. His story is the kind of tragedy that happens when no one dares speak, when power is maintained through passivity, when silence becomes the strongest weapon in the hands of those who smile and bow while planning your disappearance. He was not martyred. He was not martyred because martyrdom requires a witness, and they ensured he had none. But history, though slow, though clumsy, though often written by the same hands that once turned the keys on prison doors, eventually leaves just enough threads for us to follow. And when we do, when we return to these quiet stories buried beneath layers of ceremony and myth, we are forced to confront not just the past, but ourselves. Because David's death wasn't only about Albany's ambition, or Robert III's failure, or Parliament's complicity. It was about what people are willing to accept when they are afraid. About how easy it is to forget someone when remembering them means questioning everything around you. And that is the true legacy of David of Rothesay. Not the absence of his crown, not the shadow of his brother's reign, but the quiet warning his story has become. A reminder that power does not always kill with violence. It kills with neglect. That not all crimes require a blade. And that the most dangerous injustice is the one carried out politely, lawfully, behind closed doors. We live in a world where names are celebrated loudly when convenient and buried quietly when inconvenient. David was inconvenient. Too young, too bold, too closely tied to a lineage that threatened the wrong men at the wrong time. But if we are to learn anything from his fate, it must be this: that forgetting is not the absence of memory. It is the erasure of accountability. And to remember him, even now, even centuries later, is to restore the thread that was cut. To say, you were here, you were loved, you were feared, and your silence was not your choice. So let us remember David Stewart, not as a failure, not as a saint, not even as a prince, but as a human being who trusted too much in the protections of family, of titles, of birthright, and paid for that trust with his body, his breath, and his name. He died in the dark, but we do not have to keep him there.